She sat humiliated, overlooked and dismissed at the will reading. Then one name changed everything. Watch how the person's laughter turned into stunned disbelief when she realized she stood to inherit everything. The air in the old estate was heavy with perfume and tension. The mahogany-panelled study, with its tall bookshelves and crackling fireplace, had been chosen as the setting for the will reading. The room was as rich and imposing as the man who once occupied it, Mr. Holstrom, a titan of industry whose fortune had built entire towns. Now, the chairs he had left behind were filled with his heirs, eager to carve up his legacy. They were dressed impeccably, suits pressed sharp enough to cut glass, pearls shining under the chandelier, and expressions arranged into masks of false grief. But beneath the surface, greed simmered. Whispers danced across the polished floor as cousins nudged each other, and uncles checked their watches, impatient to hear how much they stood to gain. At the very back of the room, near the window, sat a woman who didn't belong. Her dress was plain, a faded blue that had seen better days. Her shoes were scuffed, her hair pinned neatly but without extravagance. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture stiff, her eyes lowered. Her name was Clara, a distant relative by marriage, so distant that many in the room didn't even know who she was. The others had noticed her presence the moment she walked in. Some exchanged incredulous looks, others smirked openly. One of the well-groomed nieces leaned over to her brother and whispered loudly enough for Clara to hear, "What's she doing here? She won't get a dime." Laughter rippled through the row. Clara heard it. She always heard it, but she didn't respond. Years of being overlooked had taught her silence was easier than defense. The lawyer, an older man with spectacles, perched her, and the edge of his nose cleared his throat and began reading. His voice echoed with authority as he listed Mr. Holstrom's assets, estates sprawling across the countryside, accounts brimming with wealth, and companies that still thrived in the marketplace. Each time a name was attached to an inheritance, the family leaned forward eagerly, only to either sigh with satisfaction or scowl with disappointment. "To my nephew Charles, I leave the summer house by the lake." Charles grinned smugly. "To my sister-in-law Evelyn, I leave my collection of rare art." Gasps of envy filled the room. On and on it went, the wealth being divided like slices of a pie, and Clara sat in silence, shrinking further into her chair as the snickers grew. Every time her name was skipped over, the whispers became bolder. "She's nothing. Just a charity case. She should be grateful she was even invited." Pathetic. The lawyer, however, read on without pause, his expression inscrutable. Clara tightened her grip on her lap, her knuckles white. She wanted to leave, to flee the room and escape the suffocating atmosphere, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. And then it happened. The lawyer turned to the final page of the document, his voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the restless murmurs. "To my beloved Clara." The room fell into stunned silence. Heads whipped toward her. Clara's eyes snapped up, wide with disbelief. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't speak. The lawyer continued, "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, businesses and accounts. She has been the truest companion, the kindest presence, and the one person I trust to honor my legacy with dignity." Gasps exploded across the study. Chairs scraped against the floor. Pearls rattled as jaws dropped. Clara sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat as the weight of the words sank in. The woman they had mocked, dismissed and humiliated was now the heir to everything. The silence after Clara's name was read was deafening. It was the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap, stunned, suspended, charged with disbelief. Clara blinked, certain she had misheard. Her name? The lawyer had said her name. Not Evelyn, not Charles, not any of the polished heirs dripping with entitlement, but hers. The woman in the back of the room wearing a second-hand dress. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "To Clara, I leave the remainder of my estate. All holdings, accounts, and properties not otherwise mentioned fall under her sole inheritance. This includes—" He flipped to the annex pages, his voice steady as he began to list assets so vast Clara could hardly comprehend them. The mansion itself, several companies, a portfolio of international investments, the kind of wealth that could secure generations. Gasps and angry whispers broke out across the study. "This must be a mistake," Charles shouted, his face blotchy red. He half rose from his chair, pointing an accusing finger at Clara. "She doesn't even belong here." "Sit down," the lawyer said firmly, not bothering to look up from the document. "But she's nothing," Evelyn hissed, clutching her pearls so tightly they nearly snapped. "How could he leave it all to her?" Clara's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her hands trembled in her lap. The entire room's attention was burning into her like sunlight through glass. She had walked in invisible, irrelevant, but now every pair of eyes was locked on her, wide with outrage, shock, and, worst of all, envy. The lawyer continued reading. Mr. Hallstrom specified that this decision was final, and that he held complete confidence in Clara to carry his legacy forward. He noted her unwavering loyalty and kindness during years when others only sought what they could take. The words pierced Clara's chest like arrows. Memories flooded. Back. Afternoons spent reading to Mr. Hallstrom when his eyesight dimmed, helping him walk when his health faltered, cooking him simple meals when the grand kitchen staff had long since abandoned their posts for better prospects. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. It had been natural, instinctive. He had been lonely, and she knew what loneliness felt like. But she had never imagined he would see her as anything more than a companion in those moments. She had never imagined he would entrust her with everything. A cousin sneered from across the room. She must have manipulated him, tricked him in his old age. Clara's head snapped toward the voice, her eyes wide with shock. She wanted to protest, to defend herself, but her throat was tight, words trapped behind disbelief. The lawyer's voice cut through again. Mr. Hallstrom anticipated such accusations. His will states clearly that Clara's inheritance is not to be contested. Any attempt to do so would forfeit the challenger's share entirely. The collective gasp was sharper this time, like a blade slicing through the room. The faces around Clara twisted in frustration. The greedy certainty that had glittered in their eyes when they'd arrived had drained away, replaced by fury and panic. The thought of losing their portions altogether silenced most protests, but the looks they threw Clara were venomous, dripping with resentment. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floorboards. But at the same time, a small ember of something stirred within her, something she hadn't felt in years: validation. For so long she had been treated as insignificant, the poor relation, the nobody. But Mr. Hallstrom had seen her, truly seen her, and now the world could not ignore her. Her name, once overlooked, had just rewritten the future of everyone in that room, and the irony was cruel and perfect. All at once, the name they hadn't even noticed on the guest list was now carved into the very heart of the will. Clara, the name that would change everything. The room erupted after the lawyer finished reading the clause. The polished heirs, once smug and expectant, now looked like animals backed into a corner. Their laughter, their condescension had been ripped away, leaving only raw disbelief. Clara sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap. She still couldn't process it. Her name, spoken aloud in the lawyer's even tone, attached to fortunes she couldn't fathom. Around her, whispers turned into shouts. "This is insane!" Evelyn nearly shrieked, her pearls rattling as she slammed her fist on the arm of her chair. "She doesn't deserve it!" "She's not even family," another spat, though their tone betrayed desperation more than conviction. "Father would never do this," Charles bellowed, his face redder by the second. The lawyer, calm as ever, adjusted his glasses. "I assure you, Mr. Hallstrom wrote this with his own hand. Every page is notarized, every statement witnessed. He was of sound mind and body." He tapped the papers. "And his intentions are crystal clear." The heirs shifted in their chairs, their disbelief morphing into something uglier: envy. Their eyes darted toward Clara, not with the harmless dismissal she was used to, but with venom. The weight of it pressed on her chest until she could hardly breathe. Clara's lips parted. I don't understand," she whispered. The lawyer gave her a kind, fleeting glance. "You were seen, Miss Clara. That's all you need to understand." The words struck her harder than any insult ever had. Seen. She thought back to the quiet afternoons in the garden with Mr. Hallstrom, where she had read to him as the light faded from his eyes, to the evenings when she had brewed him tea and listened to stories he told no one else, to the nights when his health had faltered and the rest of the family had been too busy to notice, and she had been there to steady him. She had not done it for a reward. She had done it because she understood loneliness, because she knew what it felt like to be invisible. And yet, those small acts, things she thought no one had noticed, had been noticed. The realization struck her like a wave. Mr. Hallstrom had valued kindness over blood, loyalty over entitlement. While others schemed for his riches, she had simply been present, and for that he had entrusted her with everything. Across the room, Evelyn's face twisted with rage. "This is theft! Manipulation! She must have wormed her way in when he was vulnerable." The lawyer's voice was sharp as he interrupted. "Enough! Mr. Holstrom anticipated such accusations, and his will includes provisions against them. Contesting this inheritance means forfeiting your share entirely. If you wish to walk away with what he left you, I suggest you hold your tongue." The room fell into reluctant silence. The heir's fury simmered, but none dared risk losing what scraps they had been given. Clara sat in the centre of it all, the focus of their hatred and disbelief. But beneath her shock, something new bloomed. Strength. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one being dismissed or overlooked. The humiliation she had walked in with was gone, replaced by a truth too undeniable to ignore. She mattered. Her chest rose as she took a deep breath. Her eyes, once fixed on the floor, lifted to meet the glares around her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The will had spoken for her. The realization spread through the room like fire. The woman they had mocked as irrelevant was now the heir to the empire. The power dynamic had shifted in a single moment, and nothing would ever be the same. The will had been read, the verdict delivered, and yet the room still crackled like a storm that refused to pass. Clara sat in the same chair, hands clasped in her lap, though now her palms were damp, her heartbeat a wild drum against her ribs. The reality of it, this fortune, this responsibility, was too vast to grasp all at once. But while she was stunned into silence, the rest of the family could not hold theirs. Evelyn, the sister-in-law who had strutted into the mansion like royalty, was the first to erupt. "This is preposterous," she shrieked, her voice quivering as much from fear as fury. "I was promised the art collection. I deserve it. I gave my life to this family." The lawyer didn't flinch. "You received the collection, as stipulated, but the remainder, the companies, the properties, the accounts, belongs to Clara." The way he said her name, plain and steady, made Evelyn's face flush scarlet. She looked as if she might faint, or claw Clara's eyes out. Charles, the late Mr. Holstrom's favoured nephew, or so he had believed, was pacing like a caged animal. "Do you know what this means? She owns the estate. This estate. We'll have to answer to her for everything." He spun toward Clara, his eyes blazing. "You don't have the faintest idea how to manage any of this." Clara flinched at the venom in his tone but forced herself to stay composed. Her voice wavered as she finally spoke. "I didn't ask for this." That only made the room louder. "Of course you asked for it," Evelyn snapped. "You schemed your way into it. Don't play innocent." "She doesn't deserve it," another cousin shouted. The accusations came like a barrage of stones, each word hurled at her designed to bruise, to remind her she had always been less, an outsider, a nobody. Clara gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles pale. But then, another voice cut through. The lawyer, calm and unshaken, spoke. Again. "Mr. Holstrom left clear notes to accompany his will. Would you like me to read them?" The heirs froze. Clara blinked, her throat dry, and nodded ever so slightly. The lawyer unfolded a sealed letter and began to read. "To my family. I know you expect this fortune to be divided among you, but you have mistaken wealth for entitlement. I have watched too many of you squander your lives chasing only what you could gain. Clara, though, gave me something none of you could: time, kindness, and honesty. When I was sick, she sat with me. When I was lonely, she spoke with me. She gave without expecting to receive. That is why she is the one I trust with all I built." Clara's vision blurred with tears as the words echoed through the study. The room was silent for a heartbeat. Then, like a dam breaking, chaos returned. Some shouted protests, others slumped in disbelief. Evelyn buried her face in her hands. Charles kicked over a chair, his pride crumbling before everyone's eyes. But Clara wept quietly, overwhelmed not by the wealth itself, but by the validation of it all. Someone had seen her worth. Someone had trusted her when no one else had. The emotions swirled: rage, envy, grief, relief, gratitude, until the room became unbearable. Clara rose slowly from her chair. The room fell quiet again, not from respect, but from shock that she dared stand at all. She wiped her tears, her voice soft but steady. "I never wanted his money, but I will honor his trust. No one dared laugh this time. The simple woman they had mocked had just spoken with the weight of an heiress, and whether they liked it or not, she was. The will reading ended, but its echoes lingered long after the lawyer closed his briefcase. Clara stood still in the grand study, overwhelmed, while the others dispersed like a storm breaking apart. But storms always leave wreckage. Evelyn was the first to leave, but not quietly. Her heels struck the polished floor with sharp cracks, and her muttering filled the silence. Ridiculous, unfair, stolen. She paused at the door and threw a final venomous glance at Clara. "You'll regret this," she hissed before sweeping out. Charles followed, less composed. He slammed his fist against the wall, startling several cousins, before storming off. His voice carried through the hallway, cursing both his uncle's name and Clara's. The cousins whispered in tight clusters as they exited, their words laced with envy. She doesn't deserve it. How did she trick him? This must be a mistake. Their eyes cut toward Clara like daggers, but none of them dared speak directly to her. And then, she was alone. The lawyer lingered only long enough to gather his papers. "Miss Clara," he said gently, his expression softening. "Mr. Holstrom's choice was deliberate. You were not a last-minute decision. He planned this carefully, knowing full well what it would mean." Clara nodded faintly, her throat too tight for words. When he left, silence descended over the mansion. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the empty study. Clara sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as they pressed against her knees. It felt surreal. Only an hour ago, she had been nothing more than an afterthought, a shadow in the corner of the family gathering. Now, the weight of an empire rested on her shoulders. She whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, "Why me?" But she already knew the answer. She thought back to Mr. Holstrom, the evenings when she had read aloud as his eyesight dimmed, the afternoons spent in quiet conversation, the way he had sighed with relief when she entered the room because it meant he wasn't alone. She hadn't given him wealth or power. She had given him time, compassion, humanity, and in return, he had given her everything. News travelled quickly. Within days, whispers of the shocking inheritance spread beyond the family. Neighbours gossiped, headlines captured the story. Simple woman inherits fortune, leaves family stunned. Some mocked, others marvelled, but all agreed it was extraordinary. The family, meanwhile, grew restless. Calls began to come in, messages dripping with false sweetness. "Clara, we should stay connected. After all, we're family." Invitations for coffee, requests for meetings, all wrapped in sugary tones that barely concealed desperation. Clara refused them all. She wasn't bitter, but she understood their motives too well. The very people who had mocked her hours earlier weren't reaching out because they cared. They were reaching out because they wanted to claw back what they had lost. In the quiet of the mansion, Clara wandered the halls, running her fingers along the polished wood and the oil paintings of ancestors long gone. It didn't feel like hers, not yet. The grandeur of it all was alien, intimidating, but as she walked she realized it didn't have to be about her. It could be about honoring him. Mr. Holstrom hadn't left her the fortune to flaunt it. He had left it because he trusted she would use it wisely, perhaps even differently than those who came before. And so the humiliation she had endured at the will reading began to fade, replaced by something steadier, resolve. They had mocked her as insignificant. Now she held everything they had coveted. But her victory wasn't in their envy. It was in proving that kindness, so often dismissed as weakness, had been stronger than greed all along. The aftermath of the will reading wasn't just wealth. It was clarity. Clara finally understood her place, not as an outsider, not as the forgotten relative, but as the one chosen to carry forward a legacy. The aftermath of the will reading wasn't just wealth, it was clarity. Clara finally understood her place, not as an outsider, not as the forgotten relative, but as the one chosen to carry forward a legacy. And no amount of envy could take that from her. The days after the will reading were unlike anything Clara had ever known. The mansion, once a distant world of polished floors and closed doors, now belonged to her. But instead of basking in triumph, she carried herself with the same humility she always had. The family, of course, simmered with resentment. Evelyn refused to speak to her, retreating to her own home with a bitterness that soured every word she uttered about that girl. Charles, humiliated, tried to rally the cousins into contesting the will, but the lawyer's warning kept them silent. Losing their small inheritances was a risk none dared take. Still, Clara could feel their eyes on her. Every visit to town, every errand seemed to draw whispers. She's the one who inherited it all. Some voices were cruel, some envious, but a few held wonder. A woman with nothing, dismissed as a nobody, had become one of the wealthiest in the county overnight. But Clara did not measure herself by their words. Instead, she wandered the mansion in the quiet hours, taking in its vastness. At first, it felt foreign, like stepping into a play where she didn't belong. The dining table stretched too far, the ceilings soared too high, and the silence pressed heavily on her shoulders. And then, she found the study. Mr. Holstrom's favourite room, lined with books and warmed by a fire that still seemed to carry his presence. She sat in his leather chair, running her fingers over the desk where he had signed countless documents. It was here, she realized, that he must have written the will. It was here he had chosen her. On the desk lay a smaller envelope, overlooked during the chaos. Her name was written on it in his hand. With trembling fingers, she opened it. "Clara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you already know what I have left to you. I imagine you are overwhelmed. I know you never sought riches, and that is why you are the only one I could trust with them. You gave me something money could not buy, your time, your compassion, your honesty. While others waited for me to die, you reminded me I was still alive. That is why you must carry this forward, not for yourself, but for others. Use it to bring light where there is darkness, to offer to others the kindness you gave me." Tears blurred her vision as she folded the letter to her chest. His words were not a burden. They were a calling. From that day, Clara's life shifted. She did not drape herself in jewels or parade through society. She began quietly, funding local schools, repairing homes for families in need, establishing scholarships for children who reminded her of herself, overlooked, underestimated, yet brimming with potential. The whispers in town changed. She was no longer the girl who inherited it all, but the woman who gave it all back. Her family's resentment never softened, but that no longer mattered. Their scorn had once defined her. Now, it was powerless. Clara's dignity was not built on their approval, but on the trust of the man who had believed in her when no one else did. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Clara stood in the garden where she had so often sat with Mr. Holstrom. She could almost hear his voice, gentle and steady, asking her to read aloud. The flowers glowed gold in the fading light, and for the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a stranger's house. It felt like home. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you. I'll make you proud." It wasn't triumph she felt, nor vengeance. It was peace. Her Victory was not in inheriting everything, but in proving that true worth is measured not in riches, but in kindness. And in that quiet moment, she knew she had already won.